Great, good evening. My name is Patrick Winter. I'm from the Guardian newspaper, and I've been selected specifically for my lack of knowledge of Birmingham politics to oversee this Leap Day debate about the future of Birmingham and its political structure. Now, I just wanted to start by saying who is here and who isn't here. Sadly, Petra Roth, who is the elected mayor of Frankfurt, couldn't make it because there is a strike, unbelievably, in Germany, in Frankfurt, and she's unable to be here, suggesting the conduct of German or Frankfurt politics could be improved. But very kindly, Richard Butler, who's the regional director of the CBI, has come in at late notice to give the view of the business community in the area. We also have with us Lord Andrew Adonis, who is currently the director of, no, he's not the director of the Institute for Government, it says here, but that's not correct. You've recently resigned from that post. He is currently the director of Progress. He was a former transport secretary, and he has very strong views on how we could develop the structure of mayors throughout Britain. We have also Lord Michael Heseltine, who's the chairman of the Regional Growth Fund and has been advising David Cameron informally about the development of city mayors. We also have Catherine Staite, on my immediate right, who is the director of Institute of Local Government Studies at the University of Birmingham. And she's going to start first. They're going to speak each for about 4 to 5 minutes, and then we'll throw it open to questions from the floor. So, Catherine.
Thank you. The question we were posed this evening is, what can an elected mayor do for the city of Birmingham and for the wider region? And I think there are a number of answers to that. The first one that comes to mind is potentially they could improve the performance of the city council. The evidence of mayors who were elected in 2002 and subsequently is quite a strong pattern of performance improvement in those authorities. So that would suggest that an elected mayor might help, but not necessarily so, because as we all know, correlation isn't the same as causation, and other authorities without mayors improved at the same time. Also, some of the authorities which did get mayors didn't do very well at all, and places such as Stoke and Doncaster come to mind in that context. Now, we can look at the comparators from other countries to say, well, how do elected mayors perform? And here, obviously, we would have been very fortunate to have had Petra Roth with us. But what's the impact of elected mayors in other countries and different types of authority? And there has been quite a lot of work done to compare, but the problem is that the political and economic and environment and context is often so different. It's very hard to say categorically that because they've worked elsewhere, they'd work here. And if we contrast what's planned here with what goes on, for example, in Germany, the local authorities areas didn't have a choice about whether they would have an elected mayor. They didn't have a referendum as we'll have. But once they had their elected mayors, the powers and the freedoms and flexibilities those mayors had were very much for the local areas to decide. So that's the reverse of the situation we've got here. Mayors can, it is argued, can use the influence and the power that comes with being directly elected and accountable to act as a catalyst for change. They can also use the informal power that will come from being well known and well connected in a city and in an area. And they can use their personal power, whatever charisma and style and charm they bring, which will help make people feel that it's important to work with them and want to make a contribution to the success of the area. So it's very much, I think, a matter for each individual mayor how they use those different types of power to good effect and the influence that can have. The formal powers of mayors are fairly limited. Under the 2000 Local Government Act, the mayors have powers they're elected for 4 years, and they are able to appoint a cabinet, but so can a leader, a traditional leader. They can also submit a budget and a strategic framework for their plans for the city, but that needs 2/3 approval from the council to be passed. So it's hardly a demagogue's charter. However, a lot of the powers that the new mayors will have, particularly the city mayors, will come from the deals that are done with central government and the freedoms and flexibilities that are granted. And some of those, the potential candidates for the mayor of Birmingham, have already started to outline what they want those powers to be. And some of the candidates see their powers stretching beyond the city into other parts of the region. And I think if you listen carefully, you'll be able to hear hackles rise all over the West Midlands at that suggestion. But that does bring us to a bit of a conundrum about whether we would have been better to have mayors covering a wider area than just the city. And I know Lord Heseltine since 1991 has been advocating the idea of sort of metro mayors, as has Lord Adonis through the Institute for Government, and other organisations have really liked the idea of having a mayor with a wider reach, particularly to fulfil the international role about inward investment and raising the profile of an area in the wider world. Political relationships in the West Midlands have been historically difficult, and so I think it's going to need a particular brand of style and charisma to overcome some of those territorial and sovereignty issues which other local authorities will perceive. Another interesting dimension to the whole elected mayoral debate is around the role of the Police and Crime Commissioner, who will be elected at the same time, but for the whole of the West Midlands. And so crime and community safety issues cut across the issues that local government are responsible for. So the way in which the mayor works with the Police and Crime Commissioner will be absolutely essential to the success of both those roles. So, and lastly, if I can just cover what does it mean for city democracy. Backbench or ward councillors have long bemoaned the fact that they feel disempowered and marginalised by the leader and cabinet system that was brought in following the 2000 Act. A lot of councils in response to that are talking about going back to the committee system, as they're now allowed to do under the Localism Act 2011. But mayoral authorities won't. They'll continue to have a cabinet. And so, it's going to be an interesting job for a mayor to engage with those backbench, those ward councillors, and to use them as champions and ambassadors for the council as a whole, and for them not to feel even more marginalised than they do at the moment. So there's certainly a significant number of leadership challenges in the role, and one small concern that I have is that we are placing a huge amount of responsibility and looking for particular skills from one person to overcome some of the structural barriers to success in the region. And it may be that we do well to focus some attention on those and not simply rely on the powers of one individual to make it all work.
Thank you very much for an incredibly helpful, objective, academic overview of some of the issues that Birmingham's going to face. And I was wondering if Lord Heseltine would like to give the Conservatives' perspective on how this debate is going to develop.
We have had the issues summarised. I was in France last summer on holiday when we had urban riots, and I was fascinated to watch UK television report. They hardly ever showed the leader of the councils where riots are taking place. And they didn't show them because the general perception is that they really weren't that important in the process of running the great cities. If I were to say to you, who is the leader of Manchester? Hands up. Well, I know in answering the question that you don't know. But if I said, who's the leader of Scotland or the leader of London, everybody knows. And they're on our television all the time. And they use every power of politics to exert influence on what happens in this country. So, well-known, directly elected men or women fighting for the interests of an identifiable community, Birmingham in this case, only brings Britain into line with what every other advanced economy of our sort is doing. If you think of the battle to be President of the United States, usually fought out by guys who've been governors of a state. If you look to see who's become President of China, there's a sporting chance he's been mayor of Shanghai. If you look at the politics of France or Germany, you'll find that the Länder, or the départements, are hugely powerful in the way in which those countries are administered. Now just think about our country. We have a Minister of Housing. We have a Secretary of State for Transport. We have a minister dealing with the work and pensions issue. We have someone dealing with agriculture. We have someone dealing with the environment. And we all know that that's the way it operates. But I can only remember one occasion on which there was a meeting to talk about a city. It was Liverpool, and it was 1981, and it was after the riots. So we have a monopoly in this country, run from London, dealing with all the issues that are relative to the great cities. And by word, it is a monopoly. When I became Secretary of State for the Department of the Environment in 1979, I asked about the role of my department and local government. I asked specifically about housing. Oh, Secretary of State, it's all very well organized. You see, if they want to build a council house, they fill in a form, and we look at the form, and we agree or not. So I thought it was very interesting. Can I see the forms? I put them up on my wall. To build a council house, a council had to fill in 80 questions. The pitch of the roof, the quality of the brick, 80 questions. The idea there was local government was complete fiction. If you look at the way in which central government exerts its powers over local government, they send out circulars. A piece of legislation is done. It's not there for local government to interpret how it should happen. They get a circular from the spending department concerned to say, this is what we think should happen. If they want to exert more influence, they have a grant mechanism of money. And increasingly, they ring-fence the grants to ever smaller parts of local authorities' activities to make sure that they have absolute control over what the local authority does. And if you have that for 50 years at an accumulating rate, have you ever heard of quangos? What do you think they do? They took power from local authorities, centralized it in a quango answerable to a central government department. If you have that process for 50 years, you develop an attitude of mind in local authorities who see their sponsoring minister as though they are branch offices. The county surveyor, he looks to see what the Ministry of Transport wants, because in the end, it's the Ministry of Transport that's got the money or the controls upon which his career depends. If you look at the Chief Constable, look at the Home Office, because that's where the career pattern is influenced. And so it goes on in each of those government departments. And so the ability of local authorities to be what they were when Birmingham was what it was has gone. And what some of us want to do is bring back the Birmingham of yesterday, where there were local men and women, powerful in their own right, identified in their own community, answerable by direct election to the people of the city. And yes, I do want to see competition. I want to see the mayor of Birmingham argue with the mayor of Manchester, or Leeds, or Newcastle, or London. I want someone to stand up for the great English cities against the ever-increasing pressure from Scotland, or Wales, or Northern Ireland. But it can't be done by the compromises and the hidden dialogue of the committee structure of the present local authorities with their absolute dependence upon what the central spending departments will allow them to do. This is not creating a new concept. It is simply recognizing that this country was not built by London. In the 19th century, when these great cities were in their heyday, they were locally driven. Indeed, one of the great phrases of 19th century politics, what Manchester thinks today, the world will think tomorrow. You never hear any phrases like that anymore about the power of local people to control their own destiny. And the essence of what I believe is that the solutions to Birmingham's problem should not be worked out by a functional department in terms of the budget they've got from the Treasury, which says we need housing of this, that, or the other colour, shape, or size. It should be worked out by local people working out what Birmingham needs, and then going to central government and saying, this is our strategy for Birmingham. If we need extra money, this is the strategy that we will use to use the money if you agree to us doing it. And that is the pattern that is adopted in every other advanced society of which I have knowledge, and I do have some knowledge because I have traveled extensively in these countries and I know broadly how they work. So this is a seminal change, not to create some vague, generalized issue of tomorrow. This is recognizing the strengths that made Birmingham and demanding you get the power back that London over the last 50 years has slowly, remorselessly taken away from you.
Michael, thank you very much. And now Andrew Adonis, Lord Adonis, is going to partly take a Labour perspective, but he's also going to, I hope, address one of the issues which I find very curious, is that we don't actually know what the specific powers of the Birmingham mayor will be at the time at which the referendum occurs on May the 3rd. And I wonder if you could explain our voters not being asked to sign a blank cheque.
Well, I basically agree with what Michael Heseltine has just said. I think those arguments to do with leadership and democracy and political authority are at the heart of the mayoral debate. And if, as Michael and I want to see, you want to see real devolution, you want to see the cities of England outside London standing up for themselves and becoming much more serious political entities, which of course will also make them much more significant economic entities, then I think that it's right to follow almost the entirety of the industrial world now and establish elected mayors. To answer Patrick's specific question, there isn't any dispute about the powers of the mayor. Let's be clear, the mayor of Birmingham, if you choose to have one at the beginning of May, will have the powers of the existing city council. Now, those are not negligible powers. Birmingham City Council has a budget of £4 billion a year. It is the largest local authority in Europe. It controls the education system, social services, local planning, a good deal of local transport, not regional transport, but a good deal of local transport. It is a hugely significant entity in its own right. The debate, and this goes to the heart of also why you should have a mayor, is whether the mayor can have additional powers. But don't forget the existing powers that the mayor will have. You know, I was Minister for Schools for 4 years. Birmingham has huge challenges to improve its education system. It really does. You know, it's at about national average now. It's clawed its way up in recent years, but it has huge challenges. It has one of the highest rates of youth unemployment in the country. It has one of the lowest levels of skills in the country. You know, a mayor of Birmingham who becomes the education mayor for Birmingham could make a transformational difference in the city with the existing powers. But the best way of, in politics, accumulating more power is to have the voice of the people behind you. And an elected mayor of Birmingham who would be known, nobody outside Birmingham has heard of Mike Whitby. Until I became Minister for Schools, I'd never heard of him. Indeed, when I asked Boris, who was the leader of Birmingham City Council soon after he'd been elected, he didn't know who the leader of Birmingham City Council was. The leader of the first city didn't know who the leader of the second city was, and they were in the same party. So, you know, there is a sort of fundamental democratic deficit here which you need to bridge. And let me just tell you, Michael told you of his experience. Let me tell you of my experience as Secretary of State for Transport. They called me, for some reason, which I can't begin to fathom, the thin controller. I've got no idea about the thin bit. However, I do understand the controller bit, because if you're Secretary of State for Transport, you basically are in charge of the transport system of England. You have the budgets, you have the planning authority, most of the major projects, whether they be roads or rail or aviation that take place are basically yours. You have responsibility for them, with one big exception, which is London. The Secretary of State for Transport should properly be described as the Secretary of State for Transport outside London. In London, the Secretary of State for Transport is the Mayor of London. That isn't what the statute says. If you go and look at the laws, all of the, indeed even the flow of money, because most of the money for transport in London comes from central governments too. It's not what the statute says, but when you've got a mayor sitting in London who is a household name, who 1 million people have voted for, and who has huge soft power as well as hard power, the capacity to speak on behalf of the business community, to speak on behalf of the voluntary sector and all of that, then a mere Secretary of State for Transport is not going to put themselves in the way of that figure. And just look at the record over the last 10 years. Transport in London, since London has had a mayor, has been transformed. The bus system has been transformed. You could do a bit of transformation in the bus system here in Birmingham. I could tell you, I could spend the next half hour just talking about the problems there. The rail system in London has been transformed. As we speak, £16 billion is being invested in the new Crossrail scheme, which is a very high-capacity east-west underground scheme in London. That would not be happening but for the Mayor of London. And it's not just government money, though a mayor is in a pretty good position to argue for government money because they do have political authority. What the Mayor of London, both Ken and then after him Boris, were able to do was to persuade the business community actually to do something almost unheard of in history, which was to agree to pay an additional tax, the supplementary business rate, in order to make Crossrail possible, because they had confidence that the Mayor of London, in charge of Transport for London, could actually deliver it. So you've got the £16 billion project, £4 billion of which is coming from the business community. You had the congestion charge, not a hope in hell of a congestion charge having been introduced without a mayor. And, of course, you've got the Boris bikes. Now, I'm told the Barclays thought they were putting all this money in because they'd be called the Barclays bikes. Well, of course, when you've got the mayor who's a cyclist and all of that, this changes quite fast. And also, last but not least, you've got the Olympics taking place in London in a few months' time. I can tell you categorically, from my experience of what happened to get the Olympics, there would be no Olympics taking place in London if there wasn't a mayor of London. We only just got it. We just very, very narrowly pipped Paris to the post. Indeed, many people said it couldn't be done before because Paris had sewn things up. Why did we manage to get it? Because the big outstanding question about London, which it was its infrastructure, whether London would, in infrastructure terms, be able to deliver the Games, Ken was able to meet at the time. Now, this is, you can say, how does all this apply to Birmingham? The powers aren't exactly the same. There are big issues to do with how you increase powers and so on. A mayor of Birmingham wouldn't have the same transport powers, but equally the mayor of London doesn't have education powers. To my mind, if I was writing the manifesto for the mayor of Birmingham, I put education first, second and third. It's so important to the city and the mayor has complete responsibility for it. But you don't need to look at the crystal ball. Look at the sorts of people who are now starting to come forward to be mayors. I see in the front row Gisela Stewart. Gisela is, if she doesn't mind my saying so, a popular and highly effective MP for this constituency, Edgbaston. The fact that somebody like Gisela thinks it would be more worthwhile to be Mayor of Birmingham than to be an MP in London is very telling about the authority of the job. Leicester decided to have a mayor last year. Who is the mayor? One of the MPs for the city of Leicester. Both of the mayors of London have been former members of Parliament. The fact that for the first time in 100 years, you've got serious national politicians who are now looking to become mayors in a way they would not dream of becoming councillors and leaders of councils tells you a lot about the charismatic and political authority which go with this job. So to my mind, it's a complete no-brainer. Not that it's perfect. No system of government is perfect. You've got to get the checks and balances right. You've got to do a lot of things to make the system work well. There is, of course, an ongoing debate about powers, but in a straightforward choice between the status quo, which has not served Birmingham well at all in recent decades, and having a strong, effective, democratic leader of Birmingham who has the voice of the people behind them and can do all the things that Lord Heseltine was talking about in terms of promoting Birmingham nationally and internationally, I think it's a no-brainer.
There's two very passionate speeches from two different generations, if you don't mind me saying, and two different political parties. And I thought I saw Sean Simon in the audience. I may have been wrong, waving his...
Sorry, Sean is at the back there.
Who's another former Labour MP who's also a candidate to be the Labour representative to be mayor in Birmingham if this does come about. Now, lastly, we're going to have Richard Butler, who's going to talk to us about the view of the business community, and in particular, he's going to talk to us about whether the business community has a uniform view about this, or whether they want to, they're actually in a pretty neutral listening mode at present.
Good evening, and as you can probably tell, I'm not the Mayor of Frankfurt. First of all, let me just set the scene from a CBI perspective. As a business lobbying organisation, we don't have a formal policy line on the mayoral debate, either in Birmingham or in other cities for that matter, and in some ways it may not be appropriate to have one. So some of my comments really are as a result of feedback I've had from businesses that are members of the CBI in Birmingham and also spread across the West Midlands area. I think the starting point would probably be that the average person in the UK, the average person in Birmingham probably doesn't have an awful lot of interest in local politics. That's borne out quite often by the relatively low turnout at elections, particularly local authority elections. There is evidence from other parts of the world, but by having a mayor, you make the whole process much more high profile, you make people more aware of the local process, and you end up with a higher turnout and a greater interest. So I think that's certainly one dynamic that the mayor process hopefully will draw out. I think there's also an issue about the sort of, particularly for a city like Birmingham, the global role that Birmingham wants to play. And I think a charismatic mayor has a key role to play in this process. Probably the best example I can put from my previous involvement with sort of international activities would be Richard Daley, who was the mayor of Chicago for a very long period of time. I think there is sort of universal recognition that he did an awful lot of good work in that city, both he and his father actually over a 40-year period, and actually raised the profile of that city quite considerably. And if you go to Chicago now, it's changed massively from the city that was there 20 years ago. So I think that's an important dimension. But I think there's also some perhaps slightly more negative issues, and this is perhaps where the business community is perhaps a little bit more split, or at least less united. If you look at the Mayor of London, Boris is a sort of strategic mayor of, 32 borough councils. He has a sort of London regional remit. He's not a mayor of just one local authority. If you apply that to a Birmingham context, what is on offer at the moment is an opportunity for a mayor of Birmingham, a mayor of the Birmingham City Council area. There are a large number of businesses that have spoken to me that have a view that perhaps we should be talking about a mayor that has a greater coverage of that, whether that is the metropolitan area, if you like, go back to the old metropolitan county council area, or perhaps the discussion over the last few years about the Birmingham or the Greater Birmingham city region. I do appreciate there's all sorts of politics there with both a small and a big P. If you look at the city region debate, which I say goes back a few years, the various areas couldn't even agree on the title for that locality, so it became the Birmingham, Black Country and Coventry City Region, hardly a snappy title. But I think there is potentially a role to look at this beyond the Birmingham City Council boundary, because Birmingham's role is a regional role. It is the major city in the region, it has a major impact on the region. If you look at transport, I dare say a significant proportion of people in this room probably work in Birmingham, but may well live outside the city. So I think that the city does have that wider role. And I think if you look at some of the issues that we've spoken about, particularly Lord Adonis spoke about some of the transport improvements in London, some of the biggest issues that businesses are raising with me in the West Midlands context, in the Birmingham context, relate to transport. Well, again, transport has to go beyond the Birmingham City Council boundaries, and it's very, very difficult to do that if you have a mayoral process that stops at the City Council boundary, because transport patterns, Birmingham's the middle of a spider's web. Transport patterns go way beyond that. So I think on the whole, business view would be, broadly favourable, but concerns about have we got the right geographic patch to be going forward with.
Thank you. Just before we open it out more widely, I just wanted to see if I could get either Lord Heseltine or Lord Adonis, or both of you, to talk a little bit about what's happened in Liverpool, where they've gone, as I understand it, direct to a mayor without a referendum, and they've also come to some kind of compact deal with government about the kind of financial aid they'll get and what they'll do in return. I just thought it'd be interesting to give a feel for how one city is already moving ahead.
Well, I think Lord Heseltine should be called Lord Liverpool, so I'll let him deal with that one.
It's very interesting. If I say a word or two about Liverpool, those of you who are as old as I am may remember in the Toxteth riots of '81, I became deeply immersed in Liverpool, and I spent 3 weeks wandering the streets trying to understand how the riots had taken place. And the absolute clear conclusion that came out of that time was that there was no one in charge. Everyone I spoke to said, well, it's someone else's fault. You know, they don't do anything. You know, you're talking to them. That's the problem. Nobody was prepared to say, I'm going to do this. And I spent 18 months then with an agenda of projects, making them work as Secretary of State. And that's where my first exposure to the realities of how local government does or doesn't work on the ground. So we now fast forward to the beginning of last year when I was in Liverpool with the Prime Minister. And out of that visit, he suggested that Terry Leahy, the former boss of Tesco, and myself should write a report about how Liverpool has changed since 1981. And so Terry and I spent some time in Liverpool, and it's not rocket science. All we did was to sit and listen to what is now a very different community than that of 1981. It's full of talent and energy and vigor. And we produced a report which was really a summation of what we were told they wanted to do. I would have thought that any local authority worth the name would have had such a report. It would have been its agenda. But very few authorities have got such a report because they're all thinking about what their sponsoring departments want them to do. So we produced this report. But that gave the Liverpool Council the opportunity to realize that someone had done the homework for them. Someone had produced a strategy. And so when the government said, we are now prepared to negotiate to give more powers to local authorities, Liverpool had got a piece of paper, a document, which said, these are the things we'd like to do. And so they leapt on the opportunity. And one of the things the government had said is that if there will be two tests. First of all, we want to devolve powers. We need to know what local authorities want. Secondly, we want to be sure that local authorities can administer the new powers we've given them. And one of the ways that they can be sure in central government that local authorities are going to change their performance standards is if they have a directly elected mayor. And so Liverpool said, very well, we won't go for the referendum, we will go ahead. Here's the agenda. We will become a mayoral authority. We will have a mayor elected in May of this year, just a couple of months ahead, and we'll get on with the task. And the government bought that package and agreed it with Liverpool. The rest of Leicester are in a similar situation because they've already got a mayoral authority and therefore they don't need a referendum. The other 10 of the big cities are facing a referendum in May, and if they move to a mayoral authority, then they will have an election in November of this year. Liverpool didn't want to waste the time as they'd already seen the opportunities, and that's why they have now voted to become a mayoral authority, and they have done a deal with the government.
Good. And you're now a free man of Liverpool, or you will be soon, as I understand it.
Next week. No, week after.
Along with Paul McCartney and Ken Dodd and William Gladstone. Now, what we're going to do is just see if there's... Very conscious that the people who've been speaking have been very much in favour of this change, and there must be people in this audience who are either nervous or opposed to having a mayor, and I'd be anxious just in this first round of maybe 3 questions to hear those opinions, but also try and frame them in the form of a question I know it's easily to just speak. So if you could have identify who you are, and also if you're trying to address the question to a particular member of the panel, that would be helpful. Did you want to start at this front? There's a mic going to come towards you.
I'm Surinder Sahota. I'm a resident and a businessman in Birmingham. I agree with the sentiments expressed by everybody. But when we look at it realistically, still the power stays with Westminster. And this is what we have always found. I was also the vice chairman of the West Midlands Regional Assembly. We know that there was at that time, it doesn't matter what party is in power. The Westminster do not want to let go of the power. We know when we were talking about the transport, we were asking, when you are talking about widening M1, the biggest bottleneck is the junction of M6 and M1, and where M5 and M6 meet. Those are the biggest bottlenecks. Those are where we have got the biggest traffic jams. But what was decided was, because the decision was made in London, the widening of M1 is only up to Milton Keynes. So they do not see what will benefit the rest of the country. So this is what we need to see, what the mayor can do, what powers the mayor has, what authority the mayor will have in deciding how they can make sure that funding is decided in this area rather than in London. How do we get that 50 years when Birmingham was a great city? We have lost all those powers. All those decisions are now being made in London. How can we get that London lobby to let go of those powers? I know that when Sir Michael Lyons did his study, he said that these 20,000 jobs should move out of London into the regions. And there was absolute blank. They didn't want to move.
Fine.
And,
look, that's fine.
The thing is, this is what we
wind
need
up?
to make sure. How we can ensure that these powers are given to whoever is then in charge of this mayor of these cities, and can make sure that the money comes with that, because the power is the money. Because when you're talking about
that's
the
fine.
budget of Birmingham,
Okay,
that's already being
you've really
decided
made your
here.
point now.
So we
we're
need additional power.
Okay, we're going to move on. So the gentleman with the glasses just here.
Thank you. I'm Kamil Hawash. I'm a member of staff here at the University of Birmingham and a Birmingham resident. My question relates to this issue about the individual and putting all this, it's not just the power, it's somebody who's got this X factor who will be able to go out and transmit positive things about Birmingham. And with the record of our tabloid journalism, that the focus might shift onto that individual, what he or she do in their lives and so on, and detract somewhat from the serious business of running this amazing city. So I wonder if with people with the knowledge of the panel, that they feel that might be an issue, or whether it isn't.
So we could end up with celebrity politics, really. Look, just the gentleman with the hands up, just right there.
Hi, I'm Daniel, Chair of Birmingham University Labour Students. While I support a mayor for Birmingham, is there a risk, though, that these mayors will create some kind of tribalism, and you'd have London against Liverpool, Birmingham against Bristol, and things like that?
Fine. Should we just take that set of questions, as one was about money, one was about celebrity politics, and one was about tribalism? And should we start at, if there's one particular aspect you want to answer, Michael?
I understand your reservation about how do you get the power back. There's only one frank answer. You have men or women tough enough to insist it happens. Alex Salmond doesn't sit in Scotland and say, oh, I don't know what to do about this. I don't think they want to give me some power. He thumps the table, he becomes a politician, he fights for Scotland. And politics being what it is, people who fight for their cause tend to influence the decision. So you have to have more confidence and more faith. And it comes to your question, what sort of candidates do you want? Well, I personally, what you get now is party leaders chosen by the councillors in private to become leaders. it would be much better if there was a primary system whereby the general public chose who the candidates were going to be, as they are now doing in America with the candidate to be the Republican challenger. So an open system of choosing the candidates would be a very healthy process. And as for the third question, will there be rivalry? Of course. Don't you think there is? Don't you think that when there's some money, that Richard Leese goes to London and says it's got to go to Manchester? Of course. And Mike Whitby goes and says it's got to go to Birmingham? That's what happens. It's inevitable. But what I think should happen is that the judgment about where the money goes should be on the basis of the quality of the request, of the plan that they've got. And Andrew made the point, and I couldn't agree with it more, the educational system of this country has been a disgrace by international standards. I mean, why we're producing huge numbers of unemployed people is because a very significant proportion of them have come through an education system with quite inadequate qualifications. And that is the fault of ministers and the educational system right the way through. We should have had councillors or elected mayors who were not prepared to tolerate the fact that year after year after year, failed schools kept failing to deliver. So, yes, there will be tensions, but we need a bit more tension to get the standards up.
Okay, on the first question, I think it's certainly not arguable that central government in this country has a powerful pull in terms of power and resources, and some of the money which is raised locally goes back to central government in order to be redistributed. So I think that pull is very strong and will need some pretty fundamental changes, I think, for it to let go. If you look at things like the total place pilots, which ran under the last government, and the community budget approaches, the idea of pooling resources to get more effective use of public resources, less duplication and so forth, that getting the money out of central government departments would make pulling teeth look positively pleasant. And the ability of local authorities to work differently and work with partners differently has been so curtailed by central government. But I think the mayors, when the elected mayors, will certainly change that balance of power, especially if they're working with their elected police and crime commissioner, and if, notwithstanding, I think, Michael's very valid point about the inevitability of rivalries, as a group, if they spoke with one voice about some things, about the delegation of power to local authorities, I think they'd be in a very strong position. And I think central government, I don't think central government's actually really woken up to the impact that the mayors could have, because nobody's experienced such a group of mayors who are responsible for the big and powerful cities. A lot of the mayors that were elected in 2002 were for smaller local authority areas quite a long way from London, and therefore had less of an impact on central government. On the personalisation, I think no matter how strong and good a mayor is as a person, they will need a really strong, good team behind them. Sir Peter Salisbury in Leicester, all of his cabinet members are deputy mayors. They'll need to be working with all the talents of the people who are currently working in Birmingham City Council, and there is a lot of talent there to be tapped. So I think that's one way of overcoming too much concentration and focus on the individual, and I think it'll be up to the individual how they share that power and responsibility.
Andrew. If I can just say one thing in response to that first question about Westminster and Whitehall never let go. Don't succumb to fatalism. The past does not have to be the future. The decline of this great city, which, let's be frank, has been a good part of the story of Birmingham over the last 40 and 50 years, the decline of this great city does not have to be its future. 30 years ago, people were saying the same about London, that the decline was inevitable, its population was going down. There were riots there too, big social dislocation. You know, nobody will ever get the transport system in London to work, the tube is congenitally bust and all of that. It is possible. If you get the right leadership, the right authority, real public support, you can start turning these things around. And a city isn't an impossible unit. It's a much easier unit to manage and to make a difference in than the country as a whole, which, of course, surprise, surprise, is why Whitehall generally makes such a big hash of it when it tries to bring about change in cities and localities. And on this business about can an elected mayor, and of course, if an elected mayor, you see, you can't wield power anonymously. If you're going to have somebody who wields power, people have got to know who they are. In a democracy, you can't hide in the shadows. The downside to that is that they then do become celebrities. But better to be a celebrity than to be a complete non-entity, which is what we too often end up with at the moment. But if you've got that person, they can bring the power back. Look at the specific issue of transport. Gordon Brown and my then boss, Tony Blair, sought to impose on London the PPP for the management of the tube. I, of course, think the PPP was perfect. It was a wonderful way of managing the system, this public-private partnership, even though it went into documents going into 3,000 pages with all kinds. It was a wonderful scheme, which was going to ensure that London's transport improved immeasurably over the next 10 to 15 years. Ken didn't agree. He set about sabotaging it systematically. He said he wanted to run it directly himself. He wanted Transport for London to do it. And actually, Boris, when he became mayor, thought so too. There is no PPP in London at the moment. Transport for London runs the tube, it ripped up the PPP, and there was nothing I or my predecessors could do about it in practical politics. The idea we were going to have a pitched battle over forcing the mayor to do this was for the birds. Where you have a strong, effective political leader with the people behind them, they will accrete power by the very nature of their office. You mentioned the M1 and the M6. Now, this is very interesting. I was Secretary of State for Transport and a Minister in the Transport Department before that for a year and a half. Do you know how many representations I had from the leader of Birmingham City Council about congestion on the M1 and the M6? None. I had not one single representation from the leader of Birmingham City Council about that. Do you know how often I had Boris on the phone to me about some usually quite second order scheme or other in London that he needed me to help with, or thought it was my job to provide yet more funding for, about once a week. He had my mobile. I could never get him off the phone. I had to start, That is why you need a mayor.
And a mobile.
Okay, just briefly on the sort of the 3 points. Looking at the money one, first of all, I think we need to look at this issue completely differently. In the current economic climate, public sector money in particular is extremely tight. So I think it's more about more effective use of the money that we have, more effective use of resources rather than trying to throw money at solutions, because the money just simply isn't there in perhaps the volume that we've been used to over the last 5, 10 or 15 years. Issue about celebrity, well, going back to my point at the beginning, I think part of the mayor opposed to the sort of leader type issue, I think the mayor can create a more high profile role. If it's more high profile, it has to have the celebrity bit with it. And actually, if you look at Boris, is there anything wrong with having a bit of a buffoon character who actually is actually doing a good job on many issues? But actually, he creates a level of interest, and likewise with Ken, a level of interest that might not have otherwise been there. And the tribalism issue, having previously had a job that was looking very internationally, I'm not really bothered about what Liverpool, Manchester or London are doing. I think as a city we need to get much more global, much more international with our outlook. And actually what else is happening in the rest of the UK, I think, is far less important than sort of our global outlook, particularly for trade and investment. The UK population is 1% of the global population. So 99% of global demand is elsewhere overseas. We need to be getting much more international in how we look at these sorts of things. And Liverpool and Manchester, relatively speaking, are insignificant in that sort of context.
Great. We may need to speed up if that's the first round of questions. There's a gentleman over here. There's a gentleman with a piece of paper, and then someone with just a hand. So we'll start over here. And the mic is coming. Sorry. Let's assume we can't hear.
Mr. Chair, it's Bernard Zisman from Birmingham. First of all, I'm a strong supporter of the Mayor. Secondly, I will reserve my argument with Lord Adonis about the alleged decline of Birmingham for another occasion. This is not the occasion for that, and we can have that another. I want to take issue with the CBI, and I realise that the worst thing I can do is to be offensive to someone who might be a guest in our midst tonight. But you said something, sir, at the beginning of your statement, which is, I often hear from business and it fills me with horror. We don't have a policy on the mayoral issue. And I say to you, why don't you have a policy? You might have some members that support it, you might have other members that don't support it. But it's about leadership, and you're not giving any leadership. I'd like to see business taking a much stronger view on this, because it's in the interest not only of the people who reside in the area, but in the interest of the businesses that prosper in the area. And you should take an interest, and it's no good coming after the event, which is what you're suggesting. We don't like the transport ending at the boundaries of Birmingham, which actually it doesn't, but you don't like this and you don't like that, and you're going to say that afterwards. So I say it kindly, without any malice. It is time for business, A, to stand up and say, we have a view on this, and even more, that you provide strong businessmen to be candidates, because we need strong leadership, and some of it will not only come from politics, but it will come from business.
Patrick, can I?
Sure.
Bernard makes a very important point, but the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce has been absolutely first class in giving the most positive leadership, and they are now using their influence to persuade chambers of commerce in the other cities to follow their example.
I presume the CBI has to straddle a slightly wider area, so it may have more difficulty coming to a unanimous view. But anyway, the next question.
Thank you. Phil Davis, former chair of the West Midlands Regional Assembly. We have a strong tradition of partnership working in the West Midlands. My great fear is that if we get an elected mayor for Birmingham, with all the claims that are being made, in my view, very unrealistic claims, we'll simply add to the divisions that exist in the region, which have been exacerbated by the removal of the regional structures through which we mediated a partnership and were able to speak to central government. Frankly, I cannot understand, and I think Catherine Staite and Richard Butler have been most clear about this, because they've mentioned actually the regional context. I cannot understand two such experienced politicians claiming all these benefits for the simple election of a mayor in one city, out of 7 boroughs, out of however many local authorities across the West Midlands region. And that is the real issue. You cannot provide the sort of services which London provides, or the sort of profile which the London Mayor provides, unless you have the sort of platform that London regional government offers, or if you have the sort of platform that Alex Salmond has in Scotland, or you have the sort of platform that the Welsh Assembly First Minister has. That's the reality. You know, we can talk all we like about the effect that it will have on Birmingham governance, but we face fundamental planning and strategic and transport issues, which have been alluded to, which can only be resolved on the basis of a regional approach. And whether that's the old West Midlands County Council, which I seem to remember Lord Heseltine had a hand in abolishing, or whether that's a wider region of the sort proposed by John Prescott, which was absolutely the right solution in my view, those issues will not go away, because if we'd had our German colleague here tonight, I'm sure she would have been saying actually what they achieve is on the basis of a federal system with clearly determined powers that are entrenched, which means that London politicians can't keep fiddling about with local government, which is what they love to do.
Excellent. I will come to you, but I did promise the gentleman just a bit further back, and we'll come to you in the next round.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Dr. Tony Cook, a visiting lecturer in the business school. I think all of our speakers tonight have demonstrated what a half-baked idea this is. But I'll pick up the theme that the previous speaker has made, concentrating on Lord Adonis's focus on transport particularly. Transport in the county of West Midlands has been absolutely abject. We opened in 1999 a metro between Birmingham, Snow Hill and Wolverhampton, talking about political determination. This was the result of the determination of a Labour councillor, Councillor Phil Bateman, who for many, many years pursued this. Since 1999, it has progressed not one iota. There have been various schemes to extend the metro out to Sutton Coldfield, extend the metro to the Black Country, extend the metro to Birmingham Airport. Now at long last it is being extended. Would you believe it is being extended from Snow Hill Station to New Street Station, a distance of less than 1 mile, and that is not going to be open until 2015. the lack of progress on transport is absolutely incredible. And the issue we have to face, if we're going to make an improvement on transport, is it must be West Midlands wide. And this idea of a mayor for the city of Birmingham is a complete nonsense. And I would just mention that within the county of West Midlands, we have a city of Wolverhampton and we have a city of Coventry. And how are they going to view the issue?
Fine, we'll just deal with that round. I think, first of all, the CBI should be allowed to defend itself from being a pusillanimous organisation that doesn't stand up for itself.
Yeah, thank you.
And then we need to deal with this issue, which is at the drier end of the market, but terribly important, which is about whether you need a city regional mayor on the city mayor, particularly for transport reasons.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Let me just sort of clarify and explain the role of the CBI, because I think this has an important bearing on this situation. The CBI is a business lobbying organisation covering the whole of the UK. We represent about 240,000 businesses, from relatively small companies to some of the biggest companies in the UK, and in fact many international companies. Our role is to lobby government to create the conditions of growth to help businesses. I think it would be inappropriate for a business organisation to be telling democratic institutions how they should vote for whether it's a leader or a mayor, for that matter. In terms of how we work with those processes, we're happy to work with the existing structures in Birmingham, which has a leader of the council. As a business community, we would be equally happy to work with a mayor. And if you sort of roll it back slightly in terms of our engagement with other organisations, the CBI works pretty effectively with regional development agencies across the whole of the country. We're doing the same now with local economic partnerships in a slightly different way, because there's a lot more of them across the UK. We didn't really form a view on whether RDAs should be abolished or not, or whether LEP should come into place, because actually that's a slightly different role. Our role really is to work with those organisations, not really to be heavily involved in determining what those structures should actually be.
Michael, would you like to deal with this issue of city regions and whether that is the better structure? And
yes, there is a coherent case which says that instead of having a mayor for Birmingham, you should have a mayor for the city region. Of course, that would be bitterly fought by the boroughs themselves, all of whom would deeply resent the creation of another tier of government, another expensive layer of bureaucracy, and one which would immediately create a potential conflict between the new pan region and the individual boroughs. But there's a simple solution. And that is that in dealing with the transport situation in Birmingham or the West Midlands, there is no way in which central government is not going to be a part of that discussion, quite rightly, because the transportation systems cover not just the region, but the interregional relationships with the north and the east and the south and the west and all that sort of thing. So there's bound to be a relationship between central government and the Ministry of Transport. The issue is whether the elected mayor of Birmingham could play a coordinating role within the other boroughs of the West Midlands in the preparation of the transport strategy. And that is what would happen. And it would happen because central government would cooperate financially in bringing that about. And my experience of local government is that if there's a financial inducement, local governments cooperate with central government. So I think it would work perfectly well. That's not to say there isn't an alternative concept, the one you suggest, which is pan-regional, but that has, A, it's not on offer, and B, it would take quite a lot of time, another 2 years to bring it about. It would immediately create great tensions within the borough structure. And so my own view is that leaving in place the borough structure and using government financial incentives with the leadership of a mayor at the centre of the great conurbation, who's bound to have a massive interest in the commuting problems of the whole conurbation, not just the centre, is a perfectly viable way forward.
Catherine, you talked about this in your opening remarks.
Yes, briefly, I think to echo Michael, we've got what we've got. This is the city mayor for Birmingham, and that's what we have to work with. It's a referendum. you'll decide whether you want a mayor or not, and then in November you'll decide which person you think will fulfil that role best. And there will be challenges for that person, there will be the potential for conflict, but there's also the potential for the beneficial application of skilled leadership to overcome some of these traditional and entrenched failures to communicate and cooperate, which have resulted in Birmingham not having an integrated transport structure. A place like Manchester shows 10 local authorities can work together and deliver an integrated transport system. It isn't impossible. But the turnout, the most recent mayoral referendum was in Salford, and I think if my memory serves me right, the turnout was very low. It was about 18%. I think, you will get what you vote for, and so turning out and voting, I think, and remembering that the power is in your hands will be really, really important.
Andrew.
I think there's a real danger of a fundamental conceptual error here. The idea, of course you need cooperation. Everyone needs to cooperate all the time. You need local authorities to cooperate together, you need central and local government to cooperate together and so on. But the idea that cooperation is easier or more powerful because it's weak bodies that are cooperating rather than strong bodies is a fundamental conceptual error. The problem that you've got in the West Midlands is that there isn't enough power located in any of the bodies which you're seeking to bring together to cooperate. That is the reason why, despite all of, I'm sure, the very well-intentioned cooperation that there's been, the transport system is such a mess and it functions so weakly. That is the status quo at the moment. Now, those who don't want to see this change have to argue that a continuation of the status quo is better than the alternative. I think that's a very hard argument to make. The idea that the Birmingham Metro would have been in a better state with the continuation of the current arrangements rather than having a mayor, well, I mean, it's in a deplorable state at the moment. The bus system is in a deplorable state. Birmingham New Street Station, after 20 years of debate about it being rebuilt, is finally being partially rebuilt, but without any addition in capacity at all. So I could go on and on. That is the status quo. Well, if you want to be a fatalist and say that actually we're so worried about the fact that this mayor, he might ruffle a few feathers in some of the other boroughs, that we're not going to do it, well, just carry on with the status quo. If you think that having some strong political leadership might actually promote better policies, promote more worthwhile cooperation, and in particular give Birmingham and the West Midlands a much stronger voice in Whitehall and Westminster, where so many of the decisions are made and so much of the money resides, then go for the mayor.
Marvellous. Well, we didn't speed up, but there we go. There's a woman here. If we could do a round of women, that would be fantastic. And then you can propose to the person next to you.
Yes, thank you,
afterwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Julian Briggs, and I live in Moseley, which is part of the Hall Green constituency in Birmingham, and I'm also a former employee of this university. My point is, how would the elected mayor work in with the present Lord Mayor and their duties? We've always been very lucky in Birmingham, I feel. We've always seemed to have had a good Lord Mayor, whichever party. The views have been very conscientious and covered their duties really well. But it would be very good to see a mayor and to see how they work together. Thank you.
It's a good question. Are there any more women who... Here we go. There are other women here, but with hands up. There's one over here with a blue jumper. And then right at the back.
Hello, I'm a teacher at one of the outstanding schools in Birmingham, so I find your comments about education in the city a gross generalisation. However, my question asks about almost the marginalisation of the role of local councillors. With such low turnout in local elections, would this elected mayor further sort of isolate our local councillors and focus this legitimacy and authority in this directly elected body? And I wondered if you could offer maybe some case studies from perhaps Leicester or other cities that have had this elected mayor.
Great. And then there was a woman right at the back. That's it.
Hello, my name's Liz Clements. I'm a resident in South Birmingham. I just wanted to ask what would be the role of an elected mayor in economic development? What could the mayor do to work with the CBI or whatever other business bodies to create jobs in the city? Because we've had the notion of a transport mayor and an education mayor, but we need a jobs mayor, in my view.
Very good. Does anyone want to deal with the question with the mayor with the chain and the mayor without the chain and how they get on with one another?
I don't think they'll need to. I think there will only be one mayor, and the civic role of mayor will no longer be will apply.
No.
In that case, I apologise. My misunderstanding.
Look, it's like the Queen and the Prime Minister. The mayor the Lord Mayor is the civic leader of the city, the ceremonial leader of the city, and very important and of great prestige and much to be admired and encouraged. The directly elected mayor is the chief executive running the services. He's the politician. The Lord Mayor would regard himself as above politics and above party politics. So it's a very important tradition, it's a very historic tradition, and don't for a minute allow anyone to take away your Lord Mayors. That would be quite wrong.
Right, I think Lord Heseltine's pronounced on that, so we don't need to ask anyone else. There is a question which I think often comes up, which is what is going to be the role of the councillor in if you have this more powerful mayor, and whether they become marginalised and therefore democracy gets diminished. Andrew, do you want to deal with that?
Well, quite a number of councillors will be in the cabinet of the mayor. Councillors, of course, still play a vitally important role in holding the mayor to account, and they represent and champion their constituents and the areas that they're elected to serve. So these are very important ongoing responsibilities. But the key thing is it seems to me, to the key context in which to put this is how important do people think that the City Council and what it does and the changes it can make, how important do they think that is in their lives? The more important they think that is, then of course the more important the mayor is, but also the more important their local councillors are too. Having less power and less authority, but dividing it up more equally, isn't necessarily better than having more power and more authority and a greater capacity to get things done, but having a mayor who would be very clearly the executive authority at the heart of that. And there's an important representational role that councillors have, an important role in holding the mayor to account, an important role in championing their constituents. But you get more than the sum of its parts from a mayoral system, because you also get a chief executive who has a much stronger and more powerful mandate to take decisions and to accrete power than you have with the status quo.
Michael, would you like to deal with the jobs mayor point?
Yes, I actually very much agree with you. And let me try. There's a point I want to make, and it's not an easy point to make, but I think it's worth trying to understand. In the great days of the English cities, they were driven by wealth, very often driven by wealthy people. And in the industrialization processes, horrendous conditions for the working people of this country developed. And it was very necessary to balance the accumulation of wealth with social provision. And if you think about it over 100 years, what was basically a group of people driving the wealth of the city as the local power has now become very much balanced in favor of welfare provision. I'm not criticizing any of that. I'm merely observing that the huge explosion of local government has been in education, in housing, in a variety of social provision of one sort and another. And that was very necessary, very desirable. I think that there needs to be a rebalancing, not in any way undermining the social provision I've analysed, but a rebalancing in favour of more power in the job creation scene. If it was left to me, I would delegate to the local authorities the problems of the unemployed. Because, again, if you think of the Department of Work and Pensions sitting in London trying to work out how to create jobs in Birmingham, I personally find that a bit worrying. I'd be much more enthusiastic if people in Birmingham were trying to work out how to create jobs and how to deal with all the various complexities of social provision rather than doing it in London. But, again, the whole process of coordinating the wealth-creating process is, I think, not at the forefront of what local government sees itself as doing today. But the danger of these sort of arguments is that you do tend to generalize. There are some local authorities which are rather good at creating jobs. We have the whole LEP, Local Enterprise Partnership Initiative, which is going on to try and bring business more into the processes of job creation in partnership with local authorities. But I don't think it's gone far enough. And I think if certainly the sort of person I would expect to come forward as a mayor would put job creation, wealth creation, very much in front of their electoral appeal. But that's not to say they're going to run down the social provision. They would add a dimension, which you could call an industrial policy.
Richard, I'd be remiss not to ask you, are you also worried about there being a tax-raising powers that might start to creep in, which you would not?
Well, let's address the positives first of all. I think the question about jobs and economic development is very important. I would certainly see the mayor having a major role to play in that. I think there's some clarity required about the role of the local enterprise partnership and the economic powers that has relative to the mayor. Certainly at the moment, obviously, Birmingham has an enterprise zone. I think that's or will become a major asset for inward investment. So I think that the mayor has a role to play in terms of putting some of those things together. I think, again, the profile figurehead role, particularly in terms of attracting foreign companies to locate in Birmingham, I think that has a really key role. The slightly more negative angle in terms of local tax raising powers, that is a concern that businesses have generally. If you go back to the worst, probably in the 1980s, when Sheffield and I think Liverpool were probably the two worst examples, where local authority rates and taxes sort of went through the roof, and it really didn't benefit anybody. It was sort of complete madness. So for the most part, very positive. The mayor needs to get much more involved in this sort of activity, and not just the CBI and the Chamber, but for all of the business organisations to work more closely together for the economic good of the area.
You could also have tax-lowering powers as well. Anyway. Just test your patience by just doing one more round very quickly, and then we'll wind it up. And if we could have the gentleman here on the left. That's it. Just over there. Wave your hand one more time so he... Thank you.
Albert Bohr, the leader of the Labour Group on Birmingham City Council. I have a comment which I hope Michael Heseltine and Andrew Adonis specifically might take up. I fail to understand why the government are being so coy about this issue of powers to the elected mayors. It was raised in the council of Birmingham Chamber before the council took a vote. There was a great deal of concern about the matter. It's been raised again tonight. If the government wished to see a yes vote, I think they would actually want to come a little more clearer about what those powers might be. Now, I raised the point when Greg Clark addressed the council meeting. He was quite specific. He listed 5 powers, 5 sets of powers, which he would be happy to see elected mayors having. And I think, therefore, the government does need to come a little clearer on the matter. They had a consultation. That consultation ended at the beginning of January. I submitted a set of proposals to DCLG on behalf of the Labour Party in Birmingham. We haven't heard from that. Just let me remind Michael and Andrew, a previous Labour government failed to take forward the idea of regional assemblies because it failed to actually set out what the powers that might be for those regional assemblies. And the first referendum in the Northeast was no. There's a warning there, and I think government did heed that warning and set out a carrot which actually helps promote the yes vote.
Demonstrating my ignorance of Birmingham politics by saying the gentleman over there. This woman over there is probably the leader of the Conservative Council.
My name's Dagmar Warlow. I work for University of Birmingham, and prior to that I spent nearly 30 years working in local government in the West Midlands. So I think I can ask this with a bit of knowledge. I think we're looking for super person, someone with superhuman powers to come in and lead our city. What my concern is, and people have mentioned having a strong team, I think it would be fair to say, with apologies to Birmingham City colleagues who may be here tonight, Birmingham City Council is not known to be overly efficient or overly effective? Will one person really make that much difference?
There are some hands over here, just the one nearest to you.
Hi, my name's Martin Bray. I work for Birmingham City Council. My question is...
You're not very efficient.
My question is the Lord Mayor's, the Mayor debate a sidestep to the lack of political debate in Britain today? Or the lack of politics in Britain today, sorry. That's to the panel.
Did you anyone? I didn't quite get that question.
Sorry, my question was, is this debate really a sidestep to the lack of politics in Britain today?
Good. Excellent. This last round, so Michael, do you want to start? And do you want to deal with Albert Bohr first, since he's demanding that you're more straightforward about what you're offering?
Albert, you will have noticed I'm not a member of the government, and in those circumstances I can't answer for the government, but perhaps I can nudge, if I come across a minister, I could nudge him and say, look, Albert's a bit upset with you. You haven't answered his questions. But yes. But you see, I think, look, I'm now going to be enormously careful of the words I use. Central government isn't enormously united on giving away power. I'm not going to say any more for fear I get a headline in the Daily Mail. Never would have happened in the Guardian, I know. But the fact is that we are talking about the incidence of power, where power is in modern Britain, and people who've got power, they hold on to it. So there's a huge battle going on. Let's be frank about it. And
headline.
Yes, that's right. It's another headline. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But what was the other questions? There was.
All the questions were about the huge battle going on inside Whitehall.
Yeah. But yes, no, there was a very important question about can one person do it? And the answer is absolutely yes. The show me a problem, and I have one question: who is in charge? Let me tell you a rather simple thought about this country's approach to local government. And I can see there'll be one or two people probably be a bit offended by what I'm going to say. The chief executive of this authority, Birmingham City Council, my guess is earning about £200,000 a year. It may be 180,000, more than that. I'm helped. More than £200,000 a year. He is the chief official, or she is the chief official. She is in charge of the machine. And that will mean that that person is in the top 10% of incomes in Birmingham. So, in other words, pretty good stuff, within the top 10%. The leader of the council, someone will tell me, gets 40,000 a year? 75. Well, that's very high compared to normal. But 75,000 compared for the leader, compared with 220,000 for the chief executive. That is totally the wrong way round. And if you look at where 75,000 gets you in the earning capability of those people running our universities, the doctors, running our businesses, 75,000 is not a huge sum of money. But we expect people to give 7 days a week, take all the flack for all the problems of the local authority for 1/3 of the salary that the chief executive is getting to administer the authority. That tells you something about who is going to volunteer to become a leader in that circumstance. And it will be either someone who's got enough money that they can afford to do it, or it will be someone who's retired, or it'll be someone who's much better than most of us about the way they motivate their life. So I think that recognizing, when I went into politics, first of all, I think members of parliament weren't paid. Then I think they got 5,000. Now they are, a cabinet minister is getting something like double what the leader of Birmingham is getting, something like double. It's simply out of all accord to common sense. The job of running Birmingham is a more important job than at least half the jobs in the cabinet. It's got more opportunity, it's responsible for more problems and tension, it could influence more about the quality of Britain's performance than at least half the members of the cabinet, and yet members of the cabinet get twice as much money. So could the right people make a difference? They really could make the difference, because put the right person in charge and they lead the process of change. Put the wrong person in charge and they suffocate change.
I was wondering whether you pick up that point about whether this is a substitute for the absence of engagement in politics.
Well, I think in the areas that have mayors, there's certainly been increasing turnout in elections where the mayors have been successful and where they've been re-elected in elections for the mayor. But I don't think the figures show a similar increase in turnout for other elections, so for central government. So I think the sort of mayoral effect on democratic participation is fairly limited. But it also, just not to forget, the backbench councillors, there is an increasingly important role for them, and the way in which the mayor behaves should help those people actually to develop their community leadership role. Whatever goes on in the city as a whole, people often do, the people who stood up tonight said where they've come from, said from a particular part of the city. So there's still a really important role for backbench councillors, for ward councillors, to have a community leadership role in their neighbourhoods and in their wards, and I think it's very, very important that they don't get overlooked.
Andrew.
Well, as a member of the Labour Party like Albert, I'm delighted to hear from Michael that there is a great civil war going on inside the government at the moment on the subject of powers to mayors. I hope it extends to many other issues too in due course, but I hope that Birmingham, out of it, manages to extract some significant new powers and devolution. The issue, which is the one that you face here in this city and is faced in the other cities holding referendums in May, is how are you most likely to be able to get hold of some of this power and authority and funding that resides at the centre at the moment and use it more effectively at the local level? And I think it's very hard to argue that you are more likely to be able to do that by sustaining the status quo rather than following London, Leicester, Liverpool, an increasingly large number of authorities now, and having a directly elected chief executive who will be able to command, by the very nature of the office, more political authority. Now, I myself don't think that leadership is about one person. I think it is about teams, but effective teams need effective leaders. And now Birmingham has lots of very talented politicians, and Albert Bohr is amongst them and has done great service in the city. The thing about a mayor, and this isn't only about the individuals, it's about the nature of the office, is that by the very nature of the office you can command that much more political authority because you have a mandate on behalf of the city as a whole, you have stood in a citywide election, and therefore you have the voice of the people behind you. That is the choice that you face in May, is whether to create that office, not as a single all-powerful figure. You do need the teams, you do need the accountability, but as somebody who can project the city nationally and internationally, who has a reasonable fighting chance of being able to bring back more power from Westminster and Whitehall and to restore, we're here in the University of Birmingham, created in memory of Joseph Chamberlain, one of the great local leaders of this city in the 19th century, to be able to restore some of that civic pride and leadership to a city that has, let's be frank, lost it over the years.
Just a final comment for me on the, are we looking for a superman or superwoman? I don't actually think we are, but I think we do have to recognise that that the role of mayor, particularly in a city the size of Birmingham, is a very, very significant role. Birmingham City is a massive employer with a multi-billion-pound budget. building on the point that Lord Adonis just made, if you look at any well-run organisation, be that a university or a major significant business, they may have a very good leader at the top, but they also have a very effective team working behind that. So I think it isn't just about the individual person, it's about the team and the resources that brings behind. And I think it would be interesting to see in May how many people vote and what the outcome is, because I think there's a sort of a general view that it will be a positive vote. It'll be interesting to see whether we do get that far.
Patrick, before you finish, please. Can I just make one point? I think it's absolutely fantastic that nearly 300 of you have turned up here tonight. This could never have happened in a local election campaign in any environment of which I have any knowledge. The fact that so many from so many different backgrounds, so many different walks of life have turned up to listen to this debate is one of the most encouraging things I've seen in my experience of local government. So you're the heroes tonight, not the rest of us up here.
Well, thank you, Lord Heseltine, for stealing my finishing remarks. I wish a lot more of you had come. I think it's a rather pathetic turnout, really, actually. No, seriously, thank you so much for coming. And I'd like to thank the University of Birmingham for arranging this, in particular the Vice-Chancellor for doing so. I really didn't expect this to be such a high quality and fascinating debate. And I didn't really think there'd be so much agreement. I'll be tempted to have a show of hands to find out how people are going to vote on May the 3rd. And I don't know whether that sort of breaches people's privacy, but why don't we do it? Who's going to vote yes on May the 3rd? Show of hands, yes. And then who's going to vote no?
Oh, fantastic.
Not after being here. You've got to have a view after this. No, seriously, there's a don't know, obviously, large contingent, and probably many won't vote. But thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to thank the panel for being so good. I'd like to thank Michael Heseltine in particular. I'm pathetically grateful for him giving me a very good story and choosing his words so carefully. So thank you very much indeed.
Well done.